Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Imam Abdullah Antepli is taking your questions about Muslims in America. Imam Antepli is Duke's first Muslim chaplain, as well as a faculty member in the Divinity School and the Duke Islamic Studies Center. Antepli delivered the opening prayer before the House of Representatives this past March.
O God of all nations, look with favor upon this esteemed Congress. Guide these important decision makers with your divine light.
To ask Imam Antepli a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
Welcome to Office Hours. My name's Sam Wells. I'm the Dean of Duke University Chapel, and one of my close colleagues in the Office of Religious Life is Imam Abdullah Antepli, and he's joining me today. Now, Imam Antepli, I'm going to call you Abdullah because you're a friend of mine, and I can't call you anything else. Abdullah, you don't look like the way imams have been portrayed in the media quite recently. You don't have an oppressed wife just by your side. You don't have an enormous great beard. You don't have a Quran in one pocket and a bomb in the other pocket. What's going on? You're not really a real imam, are you?
I get that a lot. I've been invited to many different places, and people ask, like, are you really an imam? I said, why? Because you don't look like one.
Right.
And when I say, what am I supposed to look like? What should an imam should look like? And there's this deafening, perplexing silence. Pretty much people are not as honest as you.
But there are people who wear great heavy beards, aren't there? So what's that all about?
Well, Islam doesn't demand any particular shape or outlook. People, how do they wear their beard or their clothes, their hairstyle is necessarily shaped by the culture, in the culture that they receive. If you look at Chinese Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, Turkish Muslims, they all look like different. And the climate determines, or centuries-long traditions of appearance also determines. Islam provides some principles behind everything, including dress code as well.
Now, you've got a smile on your face today, and I think that possibly is because Ramadan's just finished.
Indeed,
is that right? Tell us about that.
I think this smile is pretty much representing the smile of 1.4 billion Muslims all around the world. Yesterday was the last day of Ramadan, and today is Eid. And I should have started my opening remarks by saying Eid Mubarak, Bayram Mubarak Olsun, and Salamat Hari Raya. In all different languages, we say it differently. But Happy Eid, this is pretty much like Muslim Christmas, when everybody joyous, happy. This is the remark. This basically reflects our joy and happiness, ending Ramadan successfully, working on our spiritual muscles for the last whole month, and feeling good about ourselves and our relationship with God Almighty.
And Eid represents a special festival. What do you commemorate particularly at this time?
Well, Eid is the time where basically, especially kids are spoiled. Elders are visited. Every member of the Muslim community, especially your extended family members, everybody's well-being is checked. Everybody's particular needs have been attended. If there are people who have been talking to one another, if there are some unsettled resentments between individuals over their relationship, that's the day they try to get over those relationships. In the atmosphere, transforming atmosphere of Eid, they start talking to one another and honoring their friendships and relationships.
Well, a very appropriate day for talking about Islam in America.
Indeed.
So tell us a little bit about the Quran, because that's the obvious place to begin. Quran is at the center of the Islamic faith.
It is.
And a lot of anxieties from non-Muslims come about because there seems to be a very high view of the authority of the Quran, which can't be questioned by Muslims and can't be questioned by non-Muslims, and there's a great seems a great deal of defensiveness, and even some people sometimes say that all Muslims are fundamentalists because the Quran has to be followed slavishly and obediently. Could you tell us about that kind of perception?
Well, if you start out with wrong assumptions, it's very likely that you will end up in wrong and inaccurate calculations. And I don't want to be too dismissive of the fears of people. But it's not based on accurate information necessarily. Yes, Quran is the central authority in Islam. And what makes Ramadan very special, why Ramadan, is because it's that month that God started revealing the Holy Quran to Prophet Muhammad. Yes, the authority of Quran is above anything else. Yes, it plays a very central role in our faith, in our tradition. We derive all our ethical, moral conclusions. We try to shape our lives, every aspect of our lives, personal, professional, spiritual, family life, business life, as we learn, as we are inspired from Quran. But if you assume, because of your misinformation, that somehow Quran is a static code of law, which is very unfriendly, exclusive, which is very static, which has been frozen rules and regulations 1400 years ago, of course, once you see that authority, Quran is not like that. Yes, Quran is the eternal word of God, as how we believe. But that's how it manifests itself in the faith tradition. Nobody uses Quran as a manual. I don't wake up every morning and look, okay, what am I going to do today? It's not do's and do nots. It is the book of love, compassion, and mercy. It is the book that God says, I created you because I wanted to enter into a relationship with you. And the whole story, if I can summarize the entire gist of Quran on one foot, as Rabbi Hillel said, it is the love relationship with God and individuals, that individual relationship.
So would it be fair to say the Quran is best understood as the means through which God forms the character of the Muslim?
Indeed.
Rather than as a simple guidebook for individual moments of life?
Definitely. And it is not necessarily a law book. It is not necessarily a prayer book. It is not necessarily a history book. It is a source of prayer. It is a source of law. It is a source of ethics and moral. And it's not necessarily literal meanings are binding Muslims today. In addition to Quran, we have additional literature of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and oceans of literature, how the Muslims interpreted that foundational text of Islam.
Well, we've got well over 200 people participating in this conversation, and I'm going to pass you on one or two of the questions that they've been sending in. One from Bob Appleby from Durham, North Carolina, that's here.
Nice.
Asks, why is it that Sharia law seems to be mired in the past and not moving towards the 21st century or even the 19th century? Tell us about Sharia law in relation to the Quran and in relation to the social position of Islam.
I mean, first of all, it's so wonderful to be able to sip some water during the daylight hours after a whole month of fasting, not drinking and not eating for the whole month. Well, again, this is another question. A lot of questions these days directed to Islam and Muslims, it's not necessarily a question, it's a statement. It's based on an understanding. People are not necessarily asking for an answer, but looking for an apology to make you a bit defensive. I mean, this person believes already, uncritically, that Sharia is something, not only Sharia, any term related to Islam and Muslims, which brings fear to people's hearts and somewhat pejorative. It has to be negative.
Sharia is really about cutting people's limbs off, I think.
Exactly, stoning women. Yeah, right.
Yeah, stoning women and cutting
chopping
limbs off,
hands and demanding for a particular form of government and state. That's how 1.4 billion Muslims are living for the last 1400 years, billions of Muslims. That's not true. Sharia literally means a path to water, path to a source of water, literally meaning. So in that sense, it's very similar to Jewish word of halakha. But it means path, the way, the path. So it in general means Islam. The way we see it, it means how you direct your life, how you form your life.
So it's about creating social conditions in which people can live as Muslims.
Exactly. How can I live a life in line, in parallel, in affirmation and harmony of the God's will in this life?
So when you do hear stories about, in places like Nigeria, I've heard stories of people being stoned or being threatened with being stoned for adultery or something of this kind. Is that more due to local cultural factors than it is to Islam?
Indeed,
globally?
not only cultural, but political, social, economic. I mean, these people are implying these rules. Some of them are archaic, some of them are not relevant anymore.
I see.
And people who are not necessarily have the enough or required credentials to interpret Islamic law in that sense. So Sharia is not necessarily directly could be translated as Islamic law. We have a distinguished professor of Islamic law, Ibrahim Musa here. He convincingly argues that Islamic law and Sharia, these are not the two same things. They don't necessarily agree with one another. It cannot be used interchangeably. Sharia has always been in Islamic law a Sharia with a small s. it has never been a Sharia with the capital S. It was an ocean of literature. It was an ongoing conversation. After Prophet Muhammad died, after the revelation ended, after we have the Quran and the Hadith literature in our hands, in all these traditions, Muslims encountered new conditions. A lot of new Muslims entered Islam through different cultures, different lenses. Time has changed. So Sharia was an ongoing struggle of the Muslims, try to interpret the new life, new conditions, new realities of life in the light of the foundational teachings of Quran and the representation of the Prophet Muhammad. So it always changed. It was always, and at its sources, Sharia, in its sources, in its beginnings and origins, as it's true for the entire Islam, it is not unique. It is not distinctly created by Arabs, by Muslims only. Sharia was inspired, not only its content, but it's also in its methodology through early Christians, early Jews, people who live in the Middle East, historically when Islam was evolving. So it was always ever-changing reality. When things have become different, when Sharia become capital S, is basically after Muslim world, Muslim civilizations declined significantly and went through the devastating effects and consequences of colonialization in the 19th and the 20th century, where they lost those institutions who give the dynamism, who gives the fresh, constant struggle to interpret Islam. That dynamism disappeared and things have become very static. And what you just mentioned, we see people who are sticking those things literally. But again, that doesn't represent the entire Muslim world.
So the reference and the question to the 19th century is quite pertinent in a
yes.
sense, because that, yeah.
Yes.
So, so many people who are sending in questions are very, very thoughtful and knowledgeable about Islam, and one quotes verse 9:29.
That's my favorite.
Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden with hath been forbidden by Allah and his apostle Muhammad, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are people of the book, which includes Christians and Jews, until they pay the jizya or protection tax with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. This is the question about jihad, I think, yes. and this jihad, probably the best known word in the Quran to non-Muslims.
In this verse,
tell us about what that's really all about.
I think you're very right. I think this talks about the jihad, the concept of jihad that many people misinformed about. But in this verse, jihad, the word jihad doesn't ever mention. Right. The word for fighting or killing in Arabic is qatala. That's just mentioned. There is a term that I coined, and I want to claim that. I don't think the person who asked this question is like that. But unfortunately, there is this unfair treatment of Muslims and Muslim tradition and Muslim texts. Non-Muslim Islamic fundamentalists. They are non-Muslim, but in their treatment of the Muslim text, they are very fundamentalist. They selectively, with a certain agenda in mind, approach to a text and then pick one verse out of the entire literature and then taking completely out of context and say, this is Islam, this is Muslims. In the same perspective, if I approach the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible or even a physics book, I can take one sentence and say this is the entire field or entire science of physics. Muslims never understand Quran through its literal meaning of one verse necessarily. Anybody who tries to interpret Islam should have the general knowledge of the whole literature of Islam and a whole literature of Quran, and that's not even enough. That's just not even enough.
Tell us about, say, an organization that calls itself Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine or something. That seems to be using the word jihad in a way rather different to the way that you're portraying.
Well, maybe I should, you're right, maybe I should define what jihad is. Jihad literally means struggle. It literally means striving, struggling. And as it's been mentioned in the word of Prophet Muhammad, there are two categories of jihad. I don't deny that there's a physical aspect of jihad. There is a physical aspect of jihad where you take up your arms and fight a legitimate, just war, which has been clearly outlined and practiced throughout Islamic history. But in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that's the minor jihad. The real jihad, as Muslims do, that's what we do here. Real jihad is striving for excellence, not submitting yourself to your lower desires, your carnal desires, striving to be a better human being, striving to have a better relationship with your Lord, with your fellow human beings, and with the entire nature. But people basically take the minor jihad and its distorted meaning and basically say this is the entire jihad. But this particular verse is basically mentioned or revealed in a particular context in the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad. What we have in addition to Quran is the whole literature of Asbab al-Nuzul, the reasons of revelation. Like what we have additionally in the Quran, we are basically able to go back to the history and say when this verse was revealed, what verses were revealed before, what verses were revealed after, and what exactly was happening in the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad when this verse was revealed. And the existing additional scholarship built on these verses basically say whether these verses mention universal commandments or they are mentioning a specific time, specific community. This is one of those times when Prophet Muhammad was in a situation of war and battle. When this verse, it is not mentioned, it is not meant to be, it is never understood by Muslims to be the, and it's talking about the polytheists of the Meccan community who are waging war. And Prophet Muhammad involved in this war as a self-defense because he's been attacked by the Meccan community.
Well, let me read a question that's come in
Sure.
from Max, who's in the Duke class of 2013. He says that the Quran offers a differing guidance on how Muslims should interact with non-Muslims, ranging from respectful coexistence to Ayat 9:5. How do you embrace the whole Quran as divine revelation while accepting its seemingly conflicting passages? Does your understanding of the Quran differ in an American context than it does in a Muslim majority context?
Absolutely not. Quran itself says some of my verses are very clear and some of my verses are not very clear. God speaks in allegories, God speaks in symbols. If everything is clear, then what is it to us? I mean, there's no test.
There's no fun in that.
Exactly. It would be such a boring guide that you will have to just follow from the letter. I think what makes our free will very important, what makes our free will very, very important, significantly important for God is our ability to make moral choices, ethical choices. That's why there is some gray area. It's up to you what kind of ethical, moral standards that you have developed to understand these texts and try to live it to the best of its meaning.
Sure. Well, let's just pause for a moment in terms of Islam and think a little bit about how Islam compares to Christianity. I've got a question here from Jason Biasi, who's involved in leadership education at Duke Divinity School. He says, I'd love to hear Chaplain Antepli talk about Islamic notions of divine mercy. I know Allah is addressed as the merciful, the compassionate, but my sense is Muslims are less inclined to speak of grace as Christians do, as God's acceptance of humanity despite our sin. It seems that Islam is more inclined to speak of God, of our obedience to God's intentions for us. Could you talk about a little bit about the similarities and differences between Christianity and Islam?
Again, this is very similar to the previous few questions. Jason, I don't blame Jason to look at Islam and Muslims through his source of information and what he hears about Islam and Muslims, especially for the last 9 years, and have this worldview. I mean, if I would be an average American, non-Muslim American, and all I hear about Islam and Muslim is 9/11, jihad, terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, war, and violence, it's no surprising that. And I'm not sure if his assumption about Christianity is entirely true either. I will leave it to that part to you, whether necessarily that's true. But mercy and compassion in Islam is one of the most repeated concepts in the Quran as well as in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad himself is pictured and portrayed by the God himself as Rahmatan lil Alameen, the mercy to the all kinds, not only for Muslims, not only for human beings, but animals, planets, all the world, Alameen. It says in the plural. The concept of mercy is so central that the word mercy is being repeated at the beginning of every single chapter, and which became Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of the most merciful, the compassionate, which became a Muslim opening. Like before everything we do, before we talk, before we eat, before we drink, we keep repeating in our lives. We act in the name of the most merciful, the most compassionate, which we are called to be like that, like God, merciful and compassionate as well. I think Jason should pay attention to more diverse resources about Islam and Muslims and check the nearest mosque in his town and talk to the Muslims.
Well, let's move on to parts of our national culture right now that don't seem to be merciful and compassionate, or not perhaps as much as they might be. there are plans to build a cultural centre a couple of blocks from Ground Zero, as you may be aware. And
I never heard
these
about
have
it.
produced a little bit of controversy, including threatened burning of various documents, as you may also be aware. And my guess is that we've got around 250 viewers right now, and our viewers would be very interested to know, is this wise to think about building a notable Muslim centre so close to a place where there is still an open wound in American life?
Yes, and that wound is still bleeding, unfortunately. If you would have asked me this question in March, in February, I would have, I think, given a different answer. I would have questioned the wisdom of doing that. I would have advised to make this a little bit more sensitively and more respectfully. But I think the issue is no more having this community center too close to Ground Zero. Because as Imam Rauf, who is the behind of this project, said a couple of days ago in Larry King Live, there was a New York Times article in December of last year, front page article about this mosque. Until May, no word of opposition, nobody was interested. And another September 11 site, Pentagon, has a house of worship, a room of worship within the Pentagon.
Within the Pentagon.
Within the Pentagon. I mean, those justifications do not necessarily seem to speak to one another. But we are not discussing this proximity of the community center, whether or not this is respectful and being sensitive to the memory of the 9/11 anymore. I think over this controversy, this society, American society, unfortunately discussed whether or not Islam is a kosher religion. Islam is a culturally acceptable religion. As Muslims are equal citizens in this country, and whether or not they are subject to the same civil liberties and the religious rights also as well. And it was so painful to find out and hear that significant, very powerful voices, though they are in minority, they said absolutely not. They will never be part of us. They are not welcomed necessarily. And more importantly and more troubling is when I give the opening prayer in March in DC, I gave interviews to many media outlets. And when I said, I think things are getting worse since 9/11, in terms of this society's understanding, let alone appreciating and respect to Islam and Muslims, in the certain portions, certain pockets of American society, a lot of people pushed me back and said, I think you're exaggerating. I mean, what are you talking about? This is America. This is a land of liberties. People are open-minded here. People are educated here. What do you mean in terms of Muslim understanding of American people's understanding of Islam and Muslims are getting worse? Islamophobia is on the rise. Bigotry and hateful understanding and negative understanding of Islam and Muslim is basically on the rise. I think over this controversy, we were able to see that I was very disappointed to find that I am true. And I was correct.
Right. You were correct all along.
Yes.
Now, I recently saw that Mayor Bloomberg of New York described New York as the freest city in the world. I don't know how you measure these things, but he described in those terms. But the Duke Chapel housekeeper, Oscar Danzler, has sent in a question saying, seeing how people have reacted to the Muslim community since 9/11, have you or someone close to you faced discrimination because of your faith? Especially since you travel so much, have you had any difficulties traveling?
Nothing personally, nothing necessarily personally to me and to my family, and not that someone I know very, very closely necessarily. But if you look at the websites of the major Muslim organizations, you will see that the hate crimes against Islam and Muslims is on the rise. It's on the rise. And we haven't seen the worst. I think what we have seen is a peaceful imam trying to do something peaceful in Manhattan, and look at the backlash. Look at what kind of ugly and nasty controversy it triggered. And God forbid, God forbid, God forbid, I can never imagine what those negative understanding of Islam and Muslims could translate itself into what kind of violence. God forbid, a major failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, or God forbid again, a successful terrorist attack, either towards Americans or American troops, God forbid, or overseas or here in the United States.
Well, we've had a question referring to the interview that you referred to on Larry King Live, and it comes all the way from Cairo. Andrew in Cairo says, how can moderates reassert themselves in a mainstream media that feels a greater need to cover a pastor planning to burn Qurans in Florida on September the 11th? Is it the kinds of messages that you've been giving today about Islam, how is it possible to get a hearing for those kinds of messages?
And this
Maybe
is,
that's your question.
it is definitely. That's my question to people. Even after all these things that we have been doing, a lot of people come and ask us, where are the moderate Muslims? Why are you not condemning, or why are you not distancing yourself from these evil people like Osama bin Laden and others doing evil things in the name of Islam? Why there is no outrage against terror and violence in the name of Islam? And I look at the Muslim community, especially after 9/11, that's all what we do. We are spending all our energy, all our attention, all our time speaking to others and talking about who we are not and what we are not all about, what Islam is not all about. But somehow there is something wrong in this communication. Lines are somewhat mixed up or closed, that this message doesn't go through necessarily. Unfortunately, media pays attention to this kind of controversial issues. Those crazies on both sides receiving a lot more attention, disproportionate attention. But one thing over this Florida controversy, it was, for what it's worth, it was really therapeutical for many Muslims. That a lot of Americans, I think it was a wake-up call. They realized that Muslims do not own all the crazies in the world.
Right. Yes. No,
that, oh, we have our
Christians,
own.
we have our own.
Yeah.
We have a few.
Right.
If you came face to face with Osama bin Laden, what would you say to him?
I would say, I have to look at you. But if I would ever face the cause, I loathe of you and what you represent. I am disgusted that you are one of the person who damaged and destroyed Islam worse than anybody else in the history of Islam. He became more popular and more unknown than the Prophet of Islam. People know more of him than the Muhammad himself. No historical figure of Islam today is known more than this person. And what he represents has nothing to do. Not only what he represents or what he does is not Islamic, it's a violation of Islam. It's an attack to Islam.
So has he...
And I would definitely call CIA and FBI and inform where he is.
Right. And I mean, but so he and other people like him, have they either misunderstood the heart of Islam, the compassion, the mercy, or are they on some kind of cynical level manipulating Islam for some purpose of their own?
Both and more, Sam. I mean, what produces these high-level, high-tech, very skillful terrorists is not Muslim communities. These people are the products of certain political, historical, and economic conditions. These people are trained, funded, and through certain unfortunate, very failed foreign policies, failed economic policies. These people are the products of, unfortunately, deeply broken societies. I mean, it's really not fair to Islam and Muslims to think Islamic theology is producing these evil people, or Muslim societies are producing these people. Because Muslim societies, I mean, to speak the truth, they are not even eligible or capable of producing these high-level, sophisticated people of destruction necessarily. They themselves struggling with their basic needs. Like, look at Afghanistan. I mean, more than 60% of the country has yet to be introduced to electricity. There has been a constant generations of war in this country. No one says, I mean, how on earth this very, very undeveloped country, in this undeveloped country, how these evil people, crazy people, put their hands into very sophisticated weapons? Who produces, what countries manufacture these weapons? And how on earth these weapons get into the hands of these people in the mountains where there's no electricity? Nobody pays attention to the war economy. Like, who are the fat cats behind these people getting fatter and fatter? Who is gaining as a result of this bloodshed, hate, and fear-mongering? Definitely not Muslims. I mean, most of the victims of these terrorist attacks are Muslim themselves. They are killing the Muslims.
Sure. Well, let me move on from ground zero 9/11, because my guess is that
how far? I mean, if you move 2 blocks, 4 blocks, or 10 blocks.
I think I've known you for 2.5 years now, and I think every other day you're being asked to give some justification or some explanation for something to do with 9/11, and I think you've probably covered that fairly thoroughly.
But not only justification, but an apology.
Apology. Yeah.
Unfortunately, Muslims living in the United States and all over the world, we have been convicted for something that we didn't do. Over these unfortunate and evil, tragic events like 9/11, in the minds and hearts of many Muslims, many Americans, I'm sorry. I am not dismissing their fears and concerns, but we are already convicted. Before we open our mouth, as soon as we appear, we have to start with an apology.
Well, let's talk a bit about what it means to be a Muslim and an American then, because this is what is it, do you think, that about Islam, leaving aside 9/11, if it's possible to do that for a moment, what is it that makes that seem problematic to people? I mean, Muslims, it seems to me, are probably across the country are above average in terms of their economic level. They're producing huge amounts of taxes for the benefit of the economy. They're, by and large, law-abiding citizens. So what is it that makes... Because, you know, this country, and I speak as an English person now, has an amendment to its constitution separating church and state. So there's no question of this being a Christian country. I mean, that's constitutionally, that point has been made, was made hundreds of years ago. So it's not as if Islam is somehow un-Christian. That creates the problem. What makes the tension, do you think?
Well, what you say is, I hope people are paying attention. It's very, very true. The American Muslims, for example, compared to European Muslims, they are far ahead in terms of their integration to the American society. They represent the middle class and upper middle class. Every day I'm hearing another delegation from various European countries, from UK, from Germany, from France, coming and studying successful integration of American society, where they are not colonized, they don't necessarily live in the ghettos, they don't necessarily concentrate in one areas, they live with people in the suburbs, in the cities, and they pretty much integrate necessarily. What makes things problematic is, unfortunately, after Soviet bloc as an international enemy disappeared, Islam and Muslims have been introduced as the new international enemy to Western society, Western bloc. And that's the problem.
Because we need an enemy to
justify certain economic policies, certain defense policies, certain domestic policies. Otherwise, the whole system is defined against who are you against, an international enemy. And unfortunately, we are now paying its consequences.
I see. Now, I mean, if I were to turn that round, what's it like to be, for example, a Christian as a minority in a primarily Islamic part of the world? We've got a question here from Ahmed Chima, who says, what steps would you as a community leader urge your fellow non-Muslim chaplains and imams in the Middle East, Africa and Asia to take to ensure that non-Muslim minorities in Muslim nations feel that they too belong there? Because, I mean, for example, the number of Christians in the area of the Middle East has reduced significantly in recent years, and that must be for similar reasons to the hostility experienced by Muslims in this country.
Indeed, indeed. Over the turn of the 20th century, more than 25% of Middle East was Christian. Still, 10% of Egypt, 8% of Syria, 50% of Lebanon. After 1,000 years of Muslim majority presence there, they are Christian. And by and large, if you compare the religious minorities' history, but other parts of the world, by and large, it wasn't necessarily all rose garden. It wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily be naive. There were tension there. But by and large, it was a very successful coexistence. Look at Ottoman Empire for the most part, for example, which I take so much pride. And the Andalus, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims under the Muslim rule, living successfully. Most of the Christian philosophers, Jewish philosophers, producing their excellent work under a Muslim rule, under the Muslim majority nations. But things have changed. We don't have that civilizational strength, civilizational richness of the Muslim societies anymore. First of all, what would I advise to Christian chaplains in the Middle East? I don't think they exist. There are no Christian chaplains in the Muslim majority countries necessarily. That's why we came to this country, for their civil liberties. I will be only proud if some Muslim universities in the Muslim countries, if they hire Jewish chaplains and Christian chaplains necessarily. It's quite embarrassing and very un-Islamic for some Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia not to allow. They have significant number of Christian presence, Christian expatriates living in this country. It's a disgrace, really, that they don't allow, because that wasn't the history of Islam at all. In many chapters of the Islamic history, Muslim governments use Muslim money to repair churches, to build churches for people, and they pretty much respected people's religious freedom, and they allowed people to practice their religion necessarily. But on the other hand, what these people are doing is very problematic. But why are we in the United States, a country built on civil liberties, built on love, built on diversity, built on pluralism, why are we comparing ourselves with these despotic corrupt societies. Like, why is why they are not doing, why? So aren't we supposed to be better than them necessarily? Doesn't that the reality that makes America beautiful and wonderful?
You're really calling America to live to a higher standard.
Yes. America that I fell in love when I first came in 1998. The America that I saw. I think since 9/11, United States shied away from those foundational ideals, unfortunately, especially vis-a-vis to Islam and Muslims. I hope the United States and American society will go back to those foundational ideals and live up to their standards. And do not compare ourselves with these autocratic, despotic, non-democratic states. Happen to be Muslim majority, but they don't necessarily represent Islam, they don't necessarily represent the teachings of the Quran.
Well, Ahmed Chima has another question, and I'm happy to say there's now 330 people tuning into your conversation, so word's getting out.
I appreciate their vote of trust. I hope I'm not wasting anybody's time.
No, I don't think you are at all. I'm fascinated by I'd love to hear answer to this question, though, from Ahmed Chima. After the Fort Hood incident and the case with 4 American Muslims getting arrested by Pakistani authorities, what steps would you advise to avoid such cases in the future, and to ensure that American-born Muslims or immigrants are not exposed to al-Qaeda propaganda and brainwashed?
Well,
what about that sensitive area?
Yes, it is the responsibility of everybody to make sure our young people who grew up in the United States, they will feel the well-deserved pride to be an American citizen. They will feel to be well-deserved honor and integrity to be an American and Muslim, that they should not necessarily see that these are exclusive to one another or these are attention to one another. That's why one of our Duke professor, David Schanzer, was saying rising Islamophobia, this exclusive, unwelcoming hate and bigotry against Islam is against United States safety and security, because you are basically alienating people. You are basically making youth who grew up in the United States, by not welcoming them, by keep repeating that you don't belong here, you don't have the right to be here, making their minds and hearts more accessible to the radical extremist voices. They are basically, there's a wonderful New York Times article saying, siding with Osama bin Laden, how some of these bigotry and hateful messages about Islam and Muslims, how identical about what Osama bin Laden has been saying, that the Western values cannot be reconciled, or Muslims cannot necessarily live side by side harmoniously with Christians and Jews in the West. Well, by welcoming, by basically including Islam and Muslims to the social fabric of American society, that's the way to go.
Turning the question around again, Adam Hollowell, who teaches a course, a Religion 185, a seminar course called Faith and Political Violence. He's interested, and his students are interested in this question. What impact are the recent public debates about the Park 51 Centre in New York and the Quran burning event having on the Muslim community at Duke? How can the Duke undergraduate community as a whole be supportive of Muslim students during such public debates?
Well, it definitely came as an additional significant layer of pain that these Muslim students here on campus, for the most part, especially undergraduates, they grew up after 9/11. They were very small when 9/11 happened, but pretty much as they opened their eyes to the rest of the world, they have been dealing with these 9/11 realities. They have been going through or living through this constant and subtle dehumanization and defamation of Islam in this society, almost daily on the media, through the irresponsible remarks of politicians or some faith leaders, etc. This came a significant reassertion of that message of unwelcome. You don't belong here. And it created all sorts of anxiety, all sorts of fears. As I said to New York Times a couple of days ago, people started making jokes like, when are we going to Canada? What are the alternatives? If you don't belong here, I keep telling, like, let's go and buy a property in Sydney. You never know. Yeah. We should just go ahead. Nobody's going anywhere. But this is basically airing grief that in our home, which we came here to make this country as home, we are not welcomed by some people. By all means, they don't necessarily represent the majority of Americans. What others can do to basically be active, be involved, do not remain a silent, moderate majority, and basically marginalize these exclusive and radical and un-American voices through their voice. But unfortunately, this refusal, this loud, it's really interesting to return the favor to Americans. They've been telling, where are these moderate Muslims? Why are they not speaking against these crazies? So this is our turn, talking to our fellow non-Muslim friends, saying, where are these moderate Americans? Why are they not speaking against? And they do. And we Muslims should make sure we pay attention to the peaceful majority.
And let's stay with the Duke student context for a few moments. Tell me, I mean, all the things you've been telling us about aren't really your regular job. Your regular job is sitting down with students and discussing their concerns. And I'd like to imagine for a moment that I'm a young female Duke student and I'm coming into your office because I'm distressed. And I can't think of any other reason I'd want to come into your office if I wasn't distressed, you understand. And I'm distressed because everything in my Duke education has taught me as a young woman that I should have no barriers, no glass ceilings, that I should aim for the very highest, and that I'm getting good grades, and that I want to go to grad school, and I want to make lots of money, and I want to be famous, and all this sort of thing. And then almost out of the blue, I've got a message from one of my parents saying that they've found a nice young man for me to marry. And it's time for, you know, it may be possible for me to complete my Duke education, shall we say, but after that it's really time to settle down and have a family and perhaps leave aside for the medium term or long term, permanent term maybe, any aspirations I might have for a career of my own. Like all my friends, you know, many of whom aren't Muslims, are all going on to these interviews and things, and now suddenly I'm getting messages that I can't do that. Is that I mean, that's...
Very accurate description of what American Muslims, those who grew up in the United States, who are at Duke right now, especially as an undergraduate, domestic American Muslims, going through.
And how do you help people with that confusing
They are between multiple fires. They have generational tensions with their immigrant parents. They don't necessarily feel entirely that they understand what they go through. They don't necessarily feel all that welcomed by American society either. But this is, by all means, if you put one full room of Duke Muslims, you will see there are more than a dozen languages represented, different ethnic colors. All of them are Muslim. But if you ask me what is the main common denominator, what they share the most is being an American. What they share is speaking English as a first language, speaking English without accent, or speaking English with an American accent, unlike you and me.
That's right.
But these people are between multiple fires, basically. That they feel their parents' generation, they are mostly graceful, they are supporting, they are caring, loving people for the most part. But in terms of understanding what they go through on college campus with the certain realities of the certain dominant culture, Hollywood culture, this Disney culture, there are tensions. There are definitely tensions there. I try to walk that difficult journey with these people. I myself, an immigrant to this country. I came with the intention of making this country my home, believing its ideals. I read every single line on the Liberty Statue, and I really believed it. And I'm calling basically all American society to read those lines again and be faithful to those lines. What I tell that we shall overcome, hopefully, this difficulty will yield eventual blessings as a result of it.
So do you say to the young woman, I'll call your parents and I'll have a chat with them? Or do you say, I'll support you, whatever you choose to do? Or I mean, how do you handle a situation
I
like
never have one size fit all. In my ministry, the way I provide pastoral care, I basically develop my materials to whatever I am going to say out of what that person is sharing with me. Of course, my immediate gut reaction to support her in her resistance to a major decision when she doesn't necessarily feel ready, when she doesn't necessarily feel this is the best option for her. And yes, I end up talking a lot with parents and try to make those intergenerational issues translate to them. Not from English to other language, but culture, doing a lot of cultural translation. And also, they translating the legitimate concerns and fears of parents to these students as well.
Would you swap places with them? I mean, do you ever look at your students here on the campus and think, you know, everyone's aware of the privilege of a Duke education, everyone's aware of the wealth of the institution, the possibilities of people who have a Duke degree, everyone knows about those things, but do you ever look at them and think, gosh, my life wasn't as complicated as this?
My life is, I think, not too far off from theirs as well. I have two American children. They are growing up here. I will be very soon in their parents' shoe. And I don't necessarily see my life completely distant from them as well. Most of the challenges that they go through are my challenges as well on a daily basis.
Now, let me talk about one of the other matter that you've recently been on a trip to Europe.
Yes.
And you encountered some of the realities of European history in the 20th century. Tell us a bit more about that.
You know, I am still under the impact of this trip. It was my prayers. When I realized that I was miseducated, I was poisoned by anti-Semitism. It was, thank God, it wasn't too late to take that poison out of myself. It was in my mid-20s. And since then, I have been actively, intentionally, trying to take that poison out of myself.
Where did the poison come from? I mean, who was giving you that
poison?
Well,
I don't want to reinsert existing stereotypes. Mm-hmm. Not all Muslims are anti-Semite. But I went through a particular, very nationalist, exclusive education for the part of Turkey that I grew up. Mm-hmm. All I heard about Jews were very negative. And what shaped the image of Judaism as a religion and Jews as people was very, very negative, very destructive, through the certain policies of the State of Israel, what was happening there between the Israelis and Palestinians, etc. And what these non-Muslim Islamic fundamentalists, how they poisoned the hearts of many Americans about Islam and Muslims. We have the Muslim versions of them. We have non-Christian Christian fundamentalists. We have non-Jewish Jewish fundamentalists taking few verses of Torah or New Testament, completely out of text, and presenting us as this is the whole Christianity is all about. This is the whole Judaism all about. So there were a number of years in my life I believed that something is innate, inherently wrong with Jews and Judaism. What slowed me down was immediately when I went to madrasa and I studied religion myself. When I studied the religion itself, I said, wow, that's just not the case. That's not what Islam is saying about. That really slowed me down. But I still wasn't able to take the nearest exit and start driving into other direction. Thank God. God is really God of mercy, that He introduced me to many Jews. That mercy came and introduced me to many wonderful Jews. And since then, I've been trying to learn and inform myself and inform my community and try to resist and fought against the anti-Semitism among the Muslim community. But I was struggling. For the most part, that poison is no more there, even though I still consider myself as a recovering anti-Semite. But I think for the most part, I am clean of that poison. But still, I was having a hard time understanding Jewish collective consciousness, Jewish psyche. And I felt very strongly that without understanding Holocaust, without understanding the legacy of Holocaust, and the collective trauma that it created in the consciousness of the Jewish community today, no one can understand the real picture of present-day Judaism as religion and Jews as people. And my prayers are answered. When I was sharing this with some of my colleagues in DC, when I went there for the prayer, and then they immediately put together a program with 8 other Muslim leaders. And they took us to camps in Germany and Poland. I'm hoping I will share this experience after Ramadan on campus, various opportunities. But in short, it really came as a big slap in the face. I thought I knew something about Jewish history. I thought I knew something about Jewish pain and suffering. It is really, it must be, I think, one of the worst or the darkest chapter of human history. You know, it's tragic that soldiers are committing crimes. It's tragic that angry mobs attacking two people and killing them. It wasn't like that. It was a very well designed, geniusly well thought, very well planned, and very efficiently and successfully carried out over the 5-6 years destruction and death machines. And people, they were so efficient, like these Nazis, for the last 3 years, they were able to turn anybody who gets out of that train into ashes in less than 3 hours. It was really unbelievable. The kinds of things that I saw in those death camps. What sticks in my mind is this human hair. They were taking people's hair because they were selling to textile factories. That really shocked me the most. Like, these factories knew that they were receiving human hair and they were making yarns out of them. So I cannot only imagine thousands of pages of communication between Nazi soldiers and these factory owners or the laborers and etc. It wasn't just one particular group necessarily doing that. Somehow, that evil and destructive ideology of Nazi racism, everybody was on board, or a significant part of the society was on board at that point. It's really scary. And what I realized that I tried to understand Holocaust through what happened after Holocaust. That was another major exploration. That it is really, at least to say, disrespectful to the innocent 12 million people, 6 million of them are Jews, to try to understand their pain through what happened afterwards, because they have nothing to do. They have nothing to do after What happened after 1945, after 1946? They have nothing to do with the policies of certain states. They have nothing to do with the policies of some people. Do some people try to abuse Holocaust? Absolutely, yes. But I think adding these political realities into the whole conversation, whole attempt to Holocaust is, I think, disrespectful. Or let alone denying Holocaust, to me, which is a crime against humanity.
And there are people who feel that after the Holocaust it's no longer possible to believe in a God who acts in history, because surely if God was ever going to act in history, God would have intervened to do something about that. How, when you said your prayers through the day, at the end of the day, on that trip, when you spoke with God, what did you say? How do you come face to face with God in the face of that kind of evil?
We prayed, I think that picture was in the media, in front of the memorial in Dachau, the camp which is very close to Munich. Everybody was in tears. I mean, those are the times that your understanding of this merciful God's shaken. As Paul Tillich says, when he was a chaplain in the army during the First World War, he basically, that's when this loving God idea is challenged necessarily. But deep in heart, the challenge comes from the head. But deep in my heart, I believe that God is merciful, God is loving. And unfortunately, humankind, through our own weaknesses, we bring these tragedies, we bring these atrocities, we bring these dark chapters of humanity on ourselves, unfortunately.
And do you feel Islam has a particular way of helping people of faith generally come to terms with that? What does a Muslim say in the face of that? I mean, tragedy is the wrong word because it's perpetrated deliberately, as you've described, and systematically. So it's evil is really the only word for it.
Yes, indeed.
And does Islam have a particular way of coming to terms with that? Is there a sense of lament, or?
There is nothing necessarily in those kind of moments as a chaplain to ease people's pain necessarily. There is, of course, what Islam or how Islam comes into terms with that is the belief in the hereafter. Because as much as I believe that God is loving and just, I don't think His love and justice completely manifests itself in this life. And if there is no reward and punishment in the hereafter, I don't think God is just. I don't think God is a loving God. How Islam reconciles, come to terms with that is, there's a life after this. If Hitler is not going to go to hell, if Osama is not going to hell, then God is not just.
Well, Imam Abdullah Antepli, it's a great privilege and a joy of my life to serve in ministry alongside you and in conversation with you. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. I think more than 300 people have enjoyed listening to what you have to say today. No one is, I hope, on the Duke community ever going to say to you again, why don't moderate Muslims speak up? Because you do nothing else. but on invitation to speak up. We're very grateful for your presence among us on campus and for being with us today.
Pleasure and honor is mine. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.